Hello, and welcome back to Think Yourself Healthy podcast. I'm your host, Heather Barbieri. Before we dive into this episode, I just want to remind you that if you take a screenshot that you're listening and tag us on Instagram, we'll send you a 15% off discount for the 8-week Retrain Your Brain program. Just take a screenshot and tag me at Heather Barbieri RDN. Thanks for listening, and let's get right to it. Hello, everybody. On today's episode of Think Yourself Healthy, I have special guest, author, mental health counselor, as well as certified registered nurse, Denise Schonwald, with us. Denise, thank you so much for being here today. I'm excited to dive in and chat all things about your new book, Healing Your Body by Mastering Your Mind. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I love nursing. First of all, I've been a nurse for over 30 years. I practice mostly in critical care, and what an honor it is to take care of people, and not only patients, but their families. And I really found that career very rewarding. But as I got older, 12-hour shifts, night shifts, on call, got to be a little bit physically taxing. And yet I didn't quite want to retire. I wanted to do something else because I felt like I enjoyed working with people. I enjoyed helping and guiding and so forth. So I went back to school to become a mental health counselor. And I've been a counselor now for about a decade.
That's fabulous. Well, it's interesting that you once were a practicing nurse in ICU. We know that that can tend to be a very chaotic environment. The ball drops at any moment with the unexpected. And in my experience working with individuals, I find that often nurses tend to have some of the most dysregulated nervous systems and the most out of whack circadian rhythms. So it's very interesting that you went from this field to transitioning to the mental health field and really focusing more on that nervous system regulation and integrating that piece into your practice. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because therapists also tend to not be mentally healthy, many of us. And I don't know if it's because we're in the helping field that we feel like we ourselves don't need help. But one day in the ICU, I can remember clearly, I looked around and I was noticing that most of the patients there had sort of put themselves there because they didn't take care of themselves. A few were naturally at the end of their life, which is to be expected, but most of them were young and just unhealthy and not living healthy lives. And then therefore they were in the ICU. And I decided at that time that if I were ever a patient in the ICU, it wasn't because I neglected my own health and well-being and sort of did it to myself, if you will. When I got into mental health and sort of made that transition, I realized that what was going on with people emotionally or mental health wise was actually contributing to their physical problems, and that it all really started on the condition of the nervous system.
Yes, absolutely. I know that for myself, as a health educator, nervous system regulation is something that I have focused on for, well over a decade now. For myself, I ended up getting diagnosed with cancer back in 2011, and that was a big wake-up call for me. Personally, to kind of go back and rethink what the methods of health and wellness are. And for many of us that go into the healthcare field, we tend to be perfectionists. We tend to be type A personalities. We tend to be empaths. We tend to be individuals who are really giving of ourselves. And as a result of that, I have found that physically, health diminishes immensely, as well as emotionally and mentally. They kind of all go hand in hand, or all are correlated. And that's something that, specifically working in the mental health field for the last decade, I love educating individuals who have these diagnoses of these mental health disorders, along with a plethora of physical ailments and symptoms that go along with it, educating them and letting them know that this is all connected. Our thoughts are a huge component of this, and helping them understand that this isn't a life sentence, these diagnoses, these symptoms that they are suffering, and that if with the right guidance and the right tools and modalities, we can easily bring all of those things together to create a more optimized health and well-being or longevity vitality in terms of this thing called life we're experiencing. So it's something I'm very passionate about. So when your team reached out and suggested you and I collaborate, I was all about it. We're very like-minded, and our philosophies and practices seem to go hand in hand, which is beautiful. So thank you.
You're welcome. I find with medicine, when we have pain or we have some sort of a symptom like a cough or cold, we don't hesitate to go to the doctor. It's sort of, it's like, oh, this is happening, so therefore I need to get, some sort of opinion or evaluation. With mental health, we struggle with either addictions. We start to go to certain things in the environment to try to balance the nervous system, or we struggle with anxiety or depression, and we don't think for a minute that we feel like that's something we just need to learn to live with, rather than getting someone to help us, realizing that in the long run, it's going to come out either mental health wise or physically.
Absolutely. And I feel like there's a lot of lack of appropriate guidance in the clinical world, especially here in our allopathic system. Working in the mental health field specifically over the last decade, more specifically over the last 4 years post-COVID coming into the picture, what I saw happen clinically was very devastating. A lot of individuals very lost, turning to the conditioned environmental coping mechanisms that they were taught. And it was very disheartening to see from a clinical perspective these individuals not really getting the help that they needed. And I've personally seen a huge shift in what's happening in the mental health field over the last 4 years. It's getting crazy, and specifically around things that pertain to addiction and substance abuse. We're seeing this becoming more difficult to get specific help just for substance abuse and addiction disorders, because they're coding it so much with a mental disability or mental diagnosis in order for insurance to, justify the stay, which is very sad, in my opinion, to have to watch happen because these individuals are so desperate for help. But what I have found is that with, just the right guidance, they can pull themselves out immensely from being in a pretty dark place. I myself have struggled it'll be 3 years coming up in September. I had gotten COVID and I fried my brain. I had 104 fever for 11 days. So unfortunately, this short-circuited my hypothalamus, down-regulating my entire endocrine system, impacting my autonomic nervous system from a place where I no longer had the ability to rest and digest. I've just been chronically stuck in a state of fight or flight for a little over 3 years. And the truth is, this has been such a huge blessing. When this all initially began, it was very difficult for me, especially as a health practitioner. I felt kind of like a fraud. Like, how is this happening to me? I've spent the last 30 years dedicated specifically to health and holistic practices. How is it that, all of a sudden I'm sick, I'm going into multi-system failure? And at the end of the day, one of the things that I've discovered is that energetically, I was being impacted in an energetic way from an emotional and mental level that I didn't take into perspective at the time. And when I had the courage to make a huge decision that was coming very strongly from my solar plexus, it's like, just, you've got to do this. When I made that decision, it was a game changer in the trajectory of my ability to heal and repair. And so I made a big life choice September 1st of 2023. And from that moment on, my journey back to recovery and healing has been a beautiful progression. And I couldn't be prouder. But again, it all came down to energetics. So I'd really love to kind of dive in and talk about energy and how energy has an impact on our ability to be, healthy individuals, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. So tell us a little bit.
You created, I loved your story because what you did was you created an energetic shift.
Yes.
So you started in the mind, and what we know is that the body will follow the mind. And what happens with the nervous system becoming so dysregulated is we hold a lot of fear-based emotions. Worry and guilt are probably two of the most harmful. The
Mhm.
body really works hard to hold those emotions. Some emotions we've held since childhood. And so they sit in the body and they sit in the body. Sometimes some of these heavy emotions gain a lot of intensity and they become emotions like anger or ego, jealousy, comparison. Now they're usually bubble up to the point where we're doing or saying or acting in a way that we probably shouldn't. Many times that makes us go right back down and feel shame, guilt, remorse, and so forth. What I see is a lot of people live in a steady state of low vibrational energies. They're worrying about things that may or may not happen. They feel it's their duty to worry about the children or their parents or their coworkers, not realizing at the same time what that's doing to the body. When they get a physical diagnosis, they go to a doctor who treats the symptom. They're not trying to figure out how they got there. They're just going, okay, you're here now, and we're going to give you this medicine or this treatment and so forth. I find it a little disheartening that rarely do medical practitioners want to address the mental health component of what's contributing to these problems, which is where my expertise in both medicine and psychology have come in so that I can sort of use both of them together, which ultimately for me has been one of the best gifts I could give other people.
Agreed. Agreed. So I think that a lot of this kind of boils down to conditioning. It's a unconscious unawareness in a sense. We, grow up in environments where as early childhood, we get a fever, mom says to us, "Oh, well, let's take you to the doctor and find out what's wrong." And so ultimately, we really are conditioned and programmed to hand over our power when it comes to our health and well-being
Mhm,
starting very early in childhood. And most of us don't even have awareness. And as parents, a lot of times we don't even have awareness that this is
mhm,
the outsourcing that is occurring due to the conditioning of society standards. So
mhm,
back in 2011, when I got diagnosed with that cancer, at this time for me, I was going through a really challenging period in my life. I was a single mom raising two teenage daughters who were giving me a lot of grief. I was getting a master's degree. I was working full time as a dietitian clinically. And then I was also bartending nights and weekends just to make ends meet. And as a result of this really impacted my sleep and my stress levels immensely. Um, which ultimately led my body to being in a favorable state for a viral infection to have the
mhm,
capacity to turn into cancer. And so when this occurred and my doctor sat me down and kind of talked about my options, I decided that I was going to proceed forward with having surgery. However, I did not want to proceed forward with doing any invasive treatment such as chemo or radiation
mhm,
therapy. And at that time, I was getting a lot of grief from the medical team, disagreeing with my decision, trying to disempower me in a sense and make me feel guilty and shameful for choosing the path that I was choosing for myself. And during this time, it really made me kind of go back to the drawing board of, what are the foundational pillars of health? And as a registered dietitian nutritionist, I'm taught that nutrition, exercise, these things are a huge component of our ability to maintain a healthy well being. However, intuitively, I felt, well, those things are great. However, there's something bigger that is the foundational piece of our true health and well being, which at the time was really what came to me was sleep, stress management, as well as our gut health and how the two
mhm,
are correlated. So for me, that really, enhanced my journey as a practitioner, really tying in the brain and gut connection and how these
mhm,
two things are correlated and how ultimately they are kind of the nervous system is the internet or the web that ties the two together. And
Mhm.
so nutrition and exercise are great. However, in my opinion, they aren't the core pillars of health and
Mhm.
well-being.
Mhm.
So for me, I chose to really lean into a mindset that if I focused on the core pillars and addressed those coping mechanisms, then my body would have the capacity to do what it knows how to do, which is take care of
Mhm.
itself in a holistic manner, which is exactly what I was able to achieve. But back then, when all this was happening and I was talking about this, these were concepts that people were looking at me like I was cross-eyed and, talking to them in a foreign language. So for me as a practitioner, it's beautiful to be at this point in our evolution that you and I are having the capacity to have this conversation and that this has become more of the norm. However, I do feel like we're stuck in a little bit of a negative feedback loop because there is so much emphasis on trauma that I'm seeing a lot of people getting stuck into trauma healing loops that they can't get
Mhm.
themselves out of. Is that something that you yourself see happening? And is this something that you'd care to talk
Yes.
about?
Yes, very much so. And what happens is not only does it affect physical health and well-being, but it really has an impact on relationships
Oh,
when
mm,
we have a lot of trauma. And people will hold trauma for decades. And again, it starts to come out physically, it comes out in relationships, it comes out in addiction. For
mhm,
me, when I see somebody who's struggling with weight, for example, the first thing that people want to do is go on a diet or get on take a diet pill or something like that, but they're not addressing why are we overeating? What are
mhm,
we trying to fill? And a lot of times people aren't making that connection. And until they sort of resolve why they're doing what they're doing, or smoking or drinking or spending or whatever they're doing, the nervous system's never going to get in balance.
mhm.
So the energy in the nervous system is always very low vibrational, which is a perfect opportunity for sickness and disease to come in and replicate.
Mhm. Oh, I agree. Absolutely. I also think it's important for people to understand that when we're struggling with these coping mechanisms that society has, deemed undesirable, there's a lot of shame and guilt that is attached to that. So, specifically working with a lot of individuals who suffer from whether it's an eating disorder or it's a drug and alcohol dependence, maybe it's a toxic relationship dependence. At the end of the day, these things are all serving a purpose. They have a means to an end. And I feel it's important as an educator that we educate individuals that this is not something to be shameful or guilty, feel guilty of. These are learned and applied coping
Mhm,
mechanisms that were inherited either, genetically or from the
mhm,
environment.
mhm,
And so when we can bring awareness that these are just means to an end to help us cope with the discomfort that we are either consciously or unconsciously aware of, when we can destigmatize that and remove the shame and guilt, it really allows for individuals to have the capacity to shift their mindset into a more supportive way. But when we approach it from a guilt shaming perspective,
mhm,
all it does is draw deeper into the cycle. And at the end of the day, our nervous systems have been programmed for a very specific chemical response. And all these things are doing are helping us to achieve whatever that chemical dependence is based on what the
mhm,
environment set for us. So for me, I think that's a really big piece for people to understand is
mhm,
that society has conditioned us to be trapped in a shame guilt cycle. I personally was raised Catholic. So through my Catholicism upbringing, there was a lot of indoctrination around shame
mhm,
and guilt that I didn't even have conscious awareness were impacting me at a physical, mental, and emotional level until I got into my 40s. I was like,
Mhm.
whoa, wait, what's all this stuff? And then I realized, oh, this is all shame based, and it has everything to do with the environmental indoctrination in which I received as a early child.
Mhm.
So anyway, kind of talk to me, tell me a little bit about what your experience as a practitioner is with resistance around getting out of the shame guilt cycle.
Well, one of the things that I have found with shame and guilt, and what happens when we hold it for so many years, is it becomes normal and we get very what I call committed to it.
Hmm.
You might say, well, why would I be committed to something that's so painful? But it becomes something that we have difficulty letting go of. And what I hear clients say a lot is, I just don't know why I'm like this. I just wish I knew what, and so then they get caught in that loop of trying to decide or figure out why they're like that. And so then, and I said, well, if I told you exactly why you're like this or you have this, do you think that you could let it go? And then I just don't know why I'm like this. And so I go, okay, it doesn't matter why you have it. It matters that you do have it or that you hold it. And so I think a lot of times they just sort of, they call it mentation. They just sort of ruminate on it. And that sort of keeps them in the cycle of holding it.
Hmm.
Sometimes if they actually would let go of it, they don't know what to do without it
Hmm.
because it's become part of them.
Well, and that part of them is the core identity that they have established around having to manage the pain and suffering as the consistent variable in their
Sure.
life. And so, the unconscious mind fears that unknown of what does
Mhm.
it look like to not be attached to all of this pain and suffering? What
Mhm.
what what could that possibly look like? And that's pretty scary to the brain, because it's done such a darn good job of creating that owner's manual for us, to operate out of, to keep us safe and alive.
Yes, it
So,
also has really, when we go to whatever we go to for relief, the mind is very powerful.
mhm,
And to think, if I think it's food that I need, the mind is really not going to let go of that very quickly.
right,
I did my
absolutely.
first year as a practitioner, I did only substance abuse,
Mhm,
alcohol and drugs and so forth. And I realized it's quite a slippery slope. We do something maybe recreationally or on the weekends or in the evenings, and the next thing you know, the mind has got such a powerful attachment to it. It's very difficult, and we can't even imagine coping without it or
mhm.
letting go of it. Very
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's all fear-based, right? I know that during the beginning stages of 2020 and the pandemic, what I saw happening in the mental health field was outrageous, in terms of influx of substance abuse. And many of these individuals who were, desperately seeking help, they'd never drank alcohol a day in their life. They had never done a recreational type of drug a day in their life. And then all of a sudden, they, are faced with these really uncertain circumstances that are rooted in fear. And next thing you know, they're down the slippery slope and don't know how to get themselves out of it. But at the end of the day, it's all fear based.
Mm-hmm.
So helping
Yep.
to educate individuals around the mechanism of fear, how that low vibration supports undesirable habits. I like to use the analogy like attracts like. And so, for individuals who are struggling with weight or struggling with, poor diet lifestyles, a lot of times they're dependent on refined processed fast foods. And these fast foods, these refined processed foods, in my opinion, are very low vibrational things.
Mhm.
All of the nutrients, all of the water, essentially all of the life force, all of the organic components of them have been stripped out and then synthesized with chemicals as a alternative for flavor, for taste, for preservation. And as a result of this, when we're vibrating in those low emotional states that often are fear based, we tend to crave.
We do.
very low vibrational things. And so there's a lot of shame and guilt that is associated with that, because individuals will wake up, they'll be like, today I'm going to drink my gallon of water and I'm going to eat my 5 fruits and vegetables. And they have all of these great intentions. However, as the day progresses and they're going through their, routine, they're unconsciously operating out of that manual that was inherited. And ultimately, by evening, we tend to start navigating towards those undesirable things that we intentionally told ourselves that morning we were not going to partake in. And then next thing we know, we're unconsciously, binging or whatever it might be. And then the guilt and the shame of that awareness, oh my gosh, here I am doing the things that I promised myself I would not do. So now I've self-betrayed. Now my shame and guilt is even more enhanced, which then tends to lead to even bigger binges. And then, we're just stuck in this hamster wheel that most don't know how to get off of. So what kind of tips do you have for individuals who might be listening to this conversation right now and thinking, wow, I'm feeling really attacked. This is me that they're speaking of. What kind of tips, suggestions do you have for these individuals?
One of the, I guess my best tip is, all we're trying to sort of create here is awareness.
Mhm.
When somebody wants to go to the refrigerator every 15 minutes and look for food, just take a minute and say, okay, what do I need? Am I stressed? Am I or what is going on? Because it's not the food. The body is trying to get relief. So we can't blame the body. The
Right.
mind, the mind is in a fear-based state, and it's wanting, usually if its mind is very active, it wants sugar, carbs, and processed food because it feels like that's what it needs. Okay, that's not exactly what it should have, but that's what the mind is sort of driving us to. If we're smokers or vapors, if we're going to that, the nervous system's out of balance. So instead, if we can objectively just understand that the body is signaled and signaling us, showing us a symptom, we can just shift the energy very, very closely to the story that you told when you had your diagnosis. You said, I just decided to make a mind shift and allow my body to respond to that. It's the same thing. These cravings usually last about 15, 20 minutes. So we have to get through that. I have to have it. It's fear-based. I have to have it. Or what will happen? I don't know, but we feel like the end of the world will come.
So,
So
so a lot of people who, are suffering with these coping mechanisms that maybe are less desirable, they don't have awareness. So how do we start to create the awareness to be able to check ourselves and reflect on what that potential emotional state is that's maybe negligent at the time? How do we start to even create awareness?
one of the things that I think most people lack or struggle with is being present.
Mhm.
And a quick way to sort of check how your nervous system is or where it is, notice your temperament. Are you agitated? Are you frustrated? Are you stressed? Or, okay, that's an indication nervous system's out of balance. The other thing is, what are you reaching to feel better? Because without even realizing, I'm very stressed, and now I'm reaching to something to feel better, or I'm going shopping or getting online and buying something to feel better. Just notice those things. One of the things that I think is becoming our biggest challenge are devices,
Mhm.
because we'll take any bit of free time that we have and we sort of numb the mind by whatever we're looking at on the devices. That's causing a lot of anxiety, depression, procrastination. With the children, I'm seeing a lot of tics, a lot of anger issues. And although we feel like this is soothing to us or this is enjoyable, it is coming at a price.
Mhm.
So we have to be careful. It's not keeping us present also.
Yeah, and I think that at the end of the day, the human struggle is to be present. I think that society has conditioned us and provided us with all of these scapegoats that we're not even aware of, that we're utilizing and engaging in a regular basis. So with our with society having conditioned us to be such an, quick fix, instant gratification type of mindset, what kind of advice do you have for individuals who are struggling to get present, but don't necessarily want to be dependent on some sort of quick fix, like maybe a medication or like some other modality? What kind of advice do you have?
One of the things that I mentioned in the book is we have to have a toolbox.
Mhm,
So for example, I have things that I do monthly, like acupuncture and massage and so forth. I can't do that every day or every week, but excuse me, I space it out so that I sort of incorporate that into my self-care.
mhm.
Every day I start with about 15 minutes of meditation. And then I also, my first hour, no technology for me.
Okay. That's
So
that's good advice.
I purposely start to ease myself into my sympathetic nervous system for that
Mhm,
reason. At nighttime, I will disconnect and sort of ease myself to go to sleep. Take either a hot shower or a bath, and maybe read a little bit. But it's slowing down. It's learning to master your mind.
mhm.
Let the mind sort of just go rampant. We're going to be doing things that will cause us ultimate harm to ourselves.
So I'm curious, with you working 30 years in high intensity healthcare system, how easy was it for you to go from that transition into a mindful based practice? Like, was there a period of time there that was really challenging for you that required you to have to lean in harder to some of these tools and maybe utilize them on a more regular or an extended basis? Kind of talk to the audience a little bit about how you went from being in this high intensity field to now being in this slow, present, more mindful place.
One of the things that practitioners struggle with is not only do we have our own nervous system to balance, but when we're seeing someone who's struggling, that's pulling energy from us. I had it in the ICU because not only the families, but the patients were very sick. And so that was very pulling. With mental health, you're getting into a more personal level. It's not just treating their blood pressure or something like that. You're really getting into a lot of their very difficult experiences. And it's hard not to attach to that.
Mhm.
Certainly, you want to feel it and have compassion, or you shouldn't be in the field, but you also have to learn how to live next to it. If I didn't do a lot of my own self-care rituals, I think it would easily I would burn out very easily, because certainly after a long day, sometimes I'm very fatigued by it,
Mhm.
get very overwhelmed by it. And it takes a lot of mindfulness to keep myself in check.
So, with the mindfulness practices that you've embraced, were you utilizing these as an ICU nurse, or is this something that came after you transitioned out of that work?
It's a great question. Actually, when I was in ICU, I was very good with diet and exercise and so forth. When I got into mental health, I realized how important it was to deal with anxiety. I talk about in the book, I struggled for a while with my weight because I was a late night eater. That was how I sort of relieved the end of the evening's anxiety and stress. So I really started to address a lot of mental health things, issues that I was struggling with. I also work with a therapist myself as needed to sort of keep me grounded and help me sort of through even life's natural shifts sometimes can be tough.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Back prior to me getting my diagnosis of cancer, I had a professor who was a really close mentor of mine. And one day she had called me into her office and handed me a yoga, or no, it was a meditation CD. And I remember her handing that to me and me being like, yeah, great, thanks. What am I going to do with this? And she looked at me and she said, Heather, I think it's really important that you start leaning into more mindfulness. The pace and rate in which you are going is unsustainable, and it's going to have some really negative consequences for you. And so I brought that CD home with a lot of resistance and a lot of, who does she think she is? And I'll never forget the first time sitting down to try and attempt that meditation. And as I sat there in a stilled state, trying to release my mind of all of its thoughts and just focus on the music and the guided voice that
Mhm.
was present, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of resistance, and there was a lot of discomfort that brewed within my nervous system. And as I sat there and tried to be intentional with this practice, all it did was create more negative emotion for me that
Mhm.
ultimately left me very frustrated and 100% dismissing the importance of that practice. I think that one of the things for me specifically was there was this education that with meditation, we're just supposed to have a silent mind. And
Mhm.
so for someone who it was stuck in a very chronic, dysregulated nervous system of really thriving off of chaos, trying to go straight from chaos to absolute silence and peace was it just was a no bono. It was not happening for me.
Mhm.
So for me, the transition into that mindfulness took years. It took
Yes.
many, many years and many attempts of trying to implement different things in order to find a place that was safe enough for me to try and engage slowly and consistently.
Mhm.
um, so did you have a similar experience, or was it easier for you to go from one extreme to the other?
No, I struggled like everyone else. And it was interesting. It when we try to be mindful, the mind doesn't want to kind of give up its job.
Right.
So the mind fights and the mind, you really have to struggle with the mind. I was noticing as far as temperament for me, it would come out in sarcasm.
Mm,
And it was just something that I noticed, and I would think, like, why did I find it necessary to be sarcastic about this situation? And I realized it was just my own nervous system was out of balance, and it got enough intensity that it was coming out as I would have said it was sort of funny and humorous, but it's really not funny and humorous.
hmm.
A lot of
Yeah.
times snarky and it's
Pass.
disrespectful. Yeah, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Passive aggressive.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's interesting that you are bringing this up because I know for myself throughout my journey, I always identified as, I'll just be very transparent. So I have 5 younger brothers and I'm the oldest. And so I had a lot of responsibility at a very early age, grew up in a very chaotic household environment. And as we entered into our teens and into our early adulthood, there was a common theme that people would suggest around our family members. And they would say, "You guys are all adrenaline junkies." And I'd be like, "Oh gosh, no, we are not. Absolutely not." But the reality is, at the end of the day, we are. Every single one of us was conditioned to run and operate off of adrenaline as its primary force of energy. And so we all engaged in professions, behaviors, activities that were high adrenaline producing type
Mhm.
of circumstances. And so I had established my perceived identity around being this individual who was super high energy, who, was a big risk taker and all of these things. But at the end of the day, that was a conditioned state of being that likely developed in the womb based on mom's
Mhm.
environment and circumstances and the chemicals
Mhm.
that she was producing that programmed my, nervous system for its baseline state of operation. And so when I got into my early 40s and I was starting to reflect and question who I am, what I was, I realized that my innate state of being was not this adrenaline junkie. That was just a coping mechanism that I had acquired as a result of my environment. And so letting go of that identity of what I thought I was it was challenging because it required me to have to rethink the activities that I engaged in on a regular basis as, is this really who I am at the core of my being, or is this just a coping mechanism to help me reach my chemical state that was programmed in early childhood? And so I think for a lot of individuals, who they think they are is not necessarily who they are meant to be. And it's more of a byproduct of environmental circumstance that they have attached to as their core identity. And the idea of reflecting and challenging that can be very frightening for many. And then the thought of surrendering and letting go of some of those tendencies and characteristics can be even more frightening. So,
Mhm.
as you work with individuals and you are guiding them through this process, what kind of advice do you have for beings who are maybe in a similar situation?
I'm actually glad that you mentioned because what happens with children when I see them that have a lot of anxiety and so forth, I'm looking at the nervous system of the parents.
Yes, thank you.
But you're right, because you marinate in that womb. And so a lot of anxiety and guilt and all of that, we've marinated in it and we're also modeled it.
Hmm.
But what I say to people is I say, well, whatever your parents did, that was their skill set, that was sort of their journey. Is it serving you? Is this
Hmm.
something that because what happens is like with my sarcasm, it was serving me, but people didn't particularly like it. And I was thought to be very sort of rough around the edges and I would blame it on all kinds of things, but it wasn't serving me and I really didn't feel good about it.
Hmm.
So then it was when I realized that it wasn't something it was something very unbecoming, I could let go of it.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Oh, to be a fly on the wall that day you had that chat with yourself.
And I still have it because there are times where I'll get stressed and I can feel it sort of coming to the surface and I'll go, okay, hold on a second. Before you say something, take a minute and give yourself a little check-in.
Hmm. So when you are in that moment of having that critical state of awareness, what kind of self-talk do you have?
One of the things that I notice even before the sarcasm is I'll start to rush around and everything seems like I have to do it right this minute. And so I'll notice that I'm getting a little bit frazzled and so forth. And so for me, that is sort of a cue to go, okay, hold on a second. Because truly, there's very few things that are urgent or an emergency.
Mhm.
And it's like, I know I have to get all these things done. And I go, okay, yeah, that's true. You need to get some things done, but the world's not going to fall apart if you don't get them done.
Right.
So sometimes I have to give myself a little bit of reality check of, yes, it's important, but not to the point where I'm running around. Because what happens, not only does it affect me, but it affects people around me.
Mhm.
They call it your power of your ripple.
Right.
And people disconnect from us when we do that.
Mhm. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What could potentially someone disconnecting from us look like when we're in that perceived state of being all caught up in the moment and running around and trying to multitask? What might others' behaviors reflect or look like to us?
It depends. If the other person can also get sort of fired up and heated, then you start to attach on an anger, fighting, bickering level.
Mm.
So that's one way that it can manifest. We have to be careful. Some people, when we sort of get riled up, will pull in and they won't say anything. And a lot of times, unfortunately, these couples are married. One
Mhm.
is very explosive, and the other one sort of pulls in and doesn't say anything. And although they match together, it doesn't work really well for either one of them.
Right. So I've seen lots of those dynamics, and I have to admit, I have participated in those dynamics
Mhm.
with past relationship circumstances, and they work. They work.
Yeah, they do.
They just don't. They
Mhm.
just don't necessarily serve the means in which we desire. I like to refer to these as a lot of trauma bonding circumstances where we're in situations where it works, but it's not necessarily feeding us mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically what is needed in order to be in a healthy state of coherence. Um, and for myself, it took a lot of self work to
Mhm.
have awareness around my triggers and then the patterns that I present once those triggers have been initiated. And then what do I need personally once my trigger has been initiated? My pattern typically would want to present a Y, XYZ. How do I interrupt that pattern to serve me in a more supportive way? So I've done a lot of work and I've created programs based off of the work that I have done, but I have found that most people don't have the desire and the willpower to achieve what I have been able to achieve on a personal and professional level. So what has your experience with kind of with this been in terms of going from that ICU into the mental health field? What have you seen as a mental health practitioner in terms of one's ability and willingness to even go there to have that capacity?
What we're talking about essentially is learning emotional regulation,
Hmm.
which is challenging for all of us. Children do not have emotional regulations. That's why they throw themselves on the grocery store floor because they can't have a candy bar. Some children, when they grow up in a very chaotic home where there's a lot of stress and maybe there's addiction and so forth, they never learn that. They never really learn to, and or they don't learn to suffer appropriately as far as disappointment.
Hmm.
And so a lot of adults grow up with these personality disorders where, we see the narcissistic personality, the borderline, where they're well into their adulthood and they're screaming and they're just all over the place emotionally. Those are hard to teach people to regulate because the personality has sort of formed inappropriately based on childhood. For children or teenagers that I see, I try to get them to come up with words to before they go to anger. So with little kids, I say, okay, what's under the angry umbrella? I'm
Hmm.
disappointed. I'm frustrated. I'm overwhelmed. It's just a lot of times we go right to yelling and screaming. We can't seem to sort of make that stop to decide what we want to say that will express how we feel. But a lot of people, adults that have these personality disorders, you can try to learn to sort of rein it back a little bit, but it can be very difficult depending upon the severity of it.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like in the mental health world, this is where we lose. We lose a
Mhm.
lot. And it's very unfortunate because it does require a lot of patience and a lot of consistency and a lot of willingness. And we know within the systems that time restraints are a huge piece, and there's a lot of limitations
Mhm.
that keep individuals from having the capacity to receive the support, the knowledge, the tools, and information that's necessary to have the ability to detach from that initial diagnosis or disordered state and have the capacity to envelop something that is more supportive and healthy. I myself was diagnosed with many disorders mentally at a very early childhood. I started being medicated at the age of 11 with a multitude of mental health diagnoses. And intuitively, I felt that this wasn't the reality of my situation, that it was more of a product of my environment, and that I wasn't being conditioned in a supportive state that allowed me to have the resources necessary to learn how to emotionally regulate.
Mhm.
And so I myself was a very, very disordered being. Um, for most of my adulthood. And it wasn't until I got into probably my early to mid 40s where I had the capacity to say, you know what? All of this victimhood, all of these really unfortunate situations in my life, the only common denominator is me. And how
Mhm.
is that possible? And so for me, it really required me to have to take a hard look at myself and how I fit into this puzzle of all of these unfortunate circumstances. And was it really just a matter of luck, or did I actually have something to do with that? And I'm very grateful for my ability to create the awareness and hold the space for myself to be able to put the energy and effort into cultivating something so beautiful. I feel truly blessed for everything in which I have experienced and had the capacity to overcome in life. And it's very exciting to me to have conversations with individuals like you who have also done something similar and then have basically, created a situation where kind of give of ourselves to others to help them also find their way. So, I'm just curious, as a mental health practitioner who was a former ICU nurse, which is more fulfilling?
I think, well, let's say, they're both fulfilling in their own ways. I mean, I certainly loved the challenge of medicine and so forth. For mental health, I've been given the ability. I've written several books. I work with people all over the country. I get to meet people like you who are also passionate about mental health and physical health and integrating body, mind, and spirit. On a positive note for the listeners, though, all it takes is consistency, motivation. It's a journey.
Mhm.
And is achievable. It's not like once you get a diagnosis or once something happens, that means that's end. It means that you can always do more to better yourself, better your mental health, and better your physical health.
Mhm. So what I hear you say is at the end of the day, it requires accountability.
It does.
And that's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, how can you encourage someone to maybe open up their hearts, open up their minds to entertaining the idea of having some sort of accountability in their current situation and know that through that accountability, they have the ability to achieve a different outcome?
Well, certainly they have to have willingness.
Mhm.
So they have to be willing. And as we're going through any journey, we have to be accountable, even in business. We have our budgets and we have reports and so forth. These are all sort of easier ways of staying accountable. With our own lives and own mental health, it's we're not judging ourselves, we're noticing what we're doing and we're making little adjustments. But we have to, you and I cannot want it more than somebody else wants it for themselves. We can
Right.
guide and we can offer, but if ultimately they don't want it or they're not willing, there's not a whole lot that we can do.
Mhm.
So
So, to that point, I just want to speak very quickly. I think that as a practitioner, when you have the ability to understand that you can't control the outcomes of others despite your efforts at education and offering tools, when you have the capacity to really settle into that space and understand that this really has nothing to do about you as an educator or a practitioner, and it has everything to do with the willingness of others. I think that's a really big milestone to reach when you have the ability to disconnect from the attachment to outcome expectation.
yes. And this sort of goes back to my spiritual side. I realize that God gives us free will.
Mhm.
And people will make choices. And although I would like them to make the choice that's the better choice, or I feel is the better choice or the healthier choice, some people are not at that in that space or are able to do that. And I have to accept it.
Mhm.
I can offer, I can hope, I can wish for them, but I can't do it for them. And I have to detach from the outcome, knowing that I have done as much as I can, or I'll burn out and I'll be bitter and resentful. And that's no way to practice or serve.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Denise, it's been such a pleasure having the opportunity to
You.
chat with you. You truly are a very grounded individual. The space that you hold is very supportive. I really, through our interaction today, I just got this energetic feeling of being held, if that makes sense, that you're doing a beautiful job of just really holding and anchoring in that strength and stability for others to have the capacity to kind of nurture and come into that in a safe way. So thank you for that. So for
Welcome.
those listening, where can they find you?
I would love listeners to go to my website, which is deniseschonwald.com. There I have 3 books featured. If you'd like to visit the website, pick a book, email me. I'd be happy to send you a copy as my gift for listening.
Oh, that is very generous of you. And I would visually show your book. However, I loaned it out to a nurse practitioner the other day. I was like, you need this at this moment more than I need this. So she has it. And hopefully if she's listening, it's had some impact on her. My understanding is that she might be having a job interview coming up, so that's exciting. But anyway, thank you so much for all of your gifts, your time, your energy, your efforts that you've put into encompassing all that you do for others. This has truly been a lot of fun to have the opportunity to chat and kind of, bounce things off one another. So for the listeners, they can go to deniseschonwald.com in order to receive the very generous offer of her book. And again, the book is entitled Healing Your Body by Mastering Your Mind. And I think this is such a huge, huge component that more information is more resources are needed for individuals to really have the ability to understand how powerful they truly are. And that mind-body connection is undeniable. Well, thank you again, Denise.
Thanks for listening to the Think Yourself Healthy podcast. Do me a favor, and if you loved this episode, please go leave a review. Reviews help make sure that this content reaches more people so that we can continue to heal as a collective. Remember to take a screenshot that you're listening and tag us on Instagram at Heather Barbieri RDN for a 15% discount on the Retrain Your Brain program. See you next time.